Hey, my name is Jack Calloway. I'm 32 years old and I live alone on a small farm just outside of town in rural Tennessee. It's not the kind of place that makes anyone stop and stare. The house is an old wooden one my father left behind. The barn is small but solid, and the pasture stretches out in a few uneven acres behind it. I keep a handful of cows, put up hay when the weather holds, and spend most days fixing whatever breaks. Fences, tractors, water lines. There's always something. The work keeps my hands busy and my head quiet. I've gotten used to the quiet. Most days I don't even notice it anymore. Until that morning. I was out on the east fence line replacing a stretch of barbed wire that had rusted through. The sun was still low, the grass wet with dew, and the wire was cold enough to bite through my gloves. I had the post hole digger and a roll of new wire in the back of the truck, and I was focused on getting the job done before the heat set in. That's when I saw her. A brown hen, the same one I chased off twice already that week, came strutting through the gap where the old wire had sagged. She didn't hurry. She just stepped onto my side of the line like she had every right to be there, pecked at the ground a couple times, then looked up at me like I was the one trespassing. I straightened up, hands on my hips, and muttered under my breath. "Third time this week. Keep it up and I'm charging rent." A voice answered from the other side of the fence. "She's not trespassing, she's just checking whether your fence is in the right place." I turned. May Whitfield stood on her side of the line, one hand resting on a post. She wore a faded plaid shirt tied at the waist, jeans already smudged with dirt from the garden, and her brown hair was pulled back loose at the nape of her neck. A few strands had slipped free and stuck to her cheek. She looked like she'd been working since before sunrise, which she probably had. May's farm sits right next to mine. Same fence line, same little creek that runs between the properties, and 20-some years of our families helping each other out when it counted. Her father passed 2 years ago. Since then, she's been running the place on her own. A few horses, a vegetable garden, the chicken coop, a small greenhouse, and the roadside stand she opens on weekends selling eggs and whatever's in season. I nodded toward the hen still pecking at my grass. "May, that chicken is standing on my land." She tilted her head, considering it like the question actually required thought. "Or your land is sitting on the wrong side of my chicken." I almost smiled. That was the thing about May, she could turn the simplest fact into something you suddenly weren't sure how to argue. I kept my voice flat. If your chicken has that much ambition, the least you could do is teach her to read property lines. May stepped through the narrow gap where the fence sagged, crouched down, and scooped the hen up in both hands like she'd done it 100 times before. The bird settled against her chest without a fuss, looking far too pleased with herself. "Or you could learn something from her," May said, straightening up. "Sometimes you don't have to be afraid of a boundary to cross it." She turned and walked back toward her place without waiting for an answer. I stood there holding the roll of wire, watching her go. The morning light caught on the loose strands of her hair. I noticed the way she moved, steady, like someone who knew exactly where she was putting her feet. I noticed, too, that I was still watching after she'd already disappeared behind the line of trees that marked the edge of her garden. Before that morning, May had just been the neighbor, the girl from the farm next door. We'd known each other since we were kids in the way people in small places know each other. Waves at the end of the driveway, help when a storm took down a fence, a pie left on the porch after my father died. Nothing more than that. Nothing that required thinking about. But standing there with the wire in my hands, I realized I was thinking about her. About the way she'd smiled when she picked up that damn chicken. About the calm way she'd answered me, like she wasn't in any hurry to win the argument. And worse, I realized I was already wondering whether that hen would find another gap tomorrow. It did. Twice more that week. The second time I tried to fix the fence higher. May stood on her side with her arms crossed, watching me work like she was enjoying a private show. "You know," she called over, "I really admire your persistence." I didn't look at her. "Thanks." "Even when it doesn't work." I turned then. She was already laughing before I could come up with a reply. And somehow I ended up standing there talking to her for 20 minutes about nothing. About the price of feed. About the storm that was supposed to miss us but probably wouldn't. About the old tractor I still hadn't gotten running right. 20 minutes, I don't usually talk that much in a whole day unless I have to. That night, I sat on my front porch with a cup of coffee gone cold. The lights were on in May's kitchen across the field. I couldn't see what she was doing. Maybe canning, maybe balancing the books for the stand, maybe just sitting at the table with the radio on. It didn't matter. I watched the glow anyway. And for the first time in a long time, the quiet around my own house didn't feel quite so heavy. I told myself it was nothing. Just a neighbor. Just a chicken that didn't know where it belonged. But when I finally went inside, I left the porch light on a little longer than usual. Just in case. The cow incident happened 3 days after the chicken stopped showing up. I was out checking the south pasture when I heard May's voice carry across the fence line. Sharp, not angry exactly, but the kind of tone that makes a man stop what he's doing and listen. By the time I got over there, one of my younger heifers had pushed through a weak spot in the gate and was happily mowing down a whole row of young squash plants in May's garden. The damage wasn't terrible, but it was enough to set her back a couple of weeks on that patch. May stood in the middle of the ruined row with her hands on her hips, looking at the cow like she was trying to decide whether to lecture it or me. When she saw me coming, she didn't raise her voice. She just said, "My name, flat. Jack Calloway, do you know your cow just ate a third of my squash crop?" The heifer kept chewing, completely unbothered. I looked at the animal, then at May. "She's got good taste." May narrowed her eyes. "Is that supposed to be an apology?" "No," I said. "That's a compliment about your squash." She stared at me for a long second, then laughed even though she was clearly still irritated. "I offered to pay for the damage." She waved it off at first, but I insisted, twice what the plants were worth. She took the money without arguing, which told me she was more upset than she let on. That evening, she showed up at my door with a paper bag of the squash that had survived, still warm from the sun. I stood in the doorway holding the bag. "You're bringing vegetables to the guy whose cow just stole from your garden?" May shrugged. "I didn't want you thinking your cow has better taste than you do." She smiled when she said it. Not the polite smile she gave people at the feed store, but the smaller, real one that reached her eyes. I felt something shift in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. I asked her if she wanted to come in for a minute. She said she had chores, but she stayed long enough to drink half a glass of water and tell me the heifer had looked very pleased with herself the whole time she was eating. After that, the excuses started coming easier. I told myself I was just being a good neighbor when I drove over to return the pair of pliers she'd left on my fence post the day before. I told myself it was practical to stop by and ask what time the farmer's market opened on Saturday, even though the schedule was printed on the sign at the end of her driveway. One afternoon, I saw her out in the garden trying to stake up her tomato plants by herself before a storm rolled in, and I told myself the decent thing was to help before the rain hit. She didn't ask. I just showed up with extra stakes and twine. May never called me on any of it. She just handed me a glass of sweet tea when I finished, or a piece of warm cornbread straight from the oven, and let me stay a little longer each time. We talked about small things, how the hay was coming in, whether the creek was running low, the old man who still drove his truck too fast on the dirt road. But sometimes the talk went deeper without either of us planning it. She told me how quiet the house felt after her father died, how she'd started leaving the radio on in the kitchen even when she wasn't listening, just to have another voice in the rooms. I didn't tell her I did the same thing some nights. I just nodded and said the quiet could get loud if you let it. Word got around, of course. Nothing stays private for long in a place this small. One morning at the feed store, Martha, the woman who'd run the little grocery since before I was born, watched me load 2 bags of cattle cubes and a box of fence staples into the truck bed. "You've been spending a lot of time over at the Whitfield place lately, Jack," she said, not unkindly. I set the last bag down. Fence needed work. I was helping. Martha smiled like she knew better. "Uh-huh. Fences, water pumps, that busted truck of hers, the garden, and the chicken. All very neighborly." I didn't answer. I just nodded and drove off. But the comment stayed with me the whole way home. Because she was right. I was looking for reasons. And the reasons were getting thinner every week. The night everything started to feel different, we were fixing the water trough by her horse stall. The float valve had stuck, and the trough had run over. turning the ground around it into mud. May had already shoveled most of it out by the time I got there. We worked side by side until the sun dropped low and the fields turned that soft gold color they get right before dark. When we finished, she wiped her hands on an old towel and sat down on an overturned wooden crate. I sat on the one next to it. For a while, we didn't talk. Just listened to the horses shifting in the stall and the cicadas starting up in the trees. May looked across the pasture toward my house, small and quiet in the distance. "Do you ever feel like the farm gets too quiet?" she asked. I thought about lying. I thought about saying no, that quiet was exactly what I wanted. But the words that came out were honest. "Sometimes, yeah." She turned her head to look at me. The light was low enough that I couldn't read her expression clearly, but her voice was soft. "Getting used to being alone doesn't mean you like it." I didn't have an answer for that. I just sat there with my elbows on my knees, staring at the ground between my boots. She was right. I'd told myself for years that the silence was fine, that I'd made peace with it after my father died. But sitting next to May, with the smell of wet earth and horse and the last warmth of the day still in the air, the quiet on my own place suddenly felt heavier than it had in a long time. I wanted to say something back. I wanted to ask if she felt the same way when the lights went out in her kitchen at night. I wanted to tell her that lately the only thing that made the quiet feel less empty was knowing she was over here, moving around her own house, probably arguing with the chickens or talking to the horses like they understood every word. But I didn't say any of it. I just nodded once, slow, and kept looking at the ground. May didn't push. She never did. She just sat there with me until the first stars came out, then stood up and brushed off her jeans. "Thanks for the help, Jack," she said. "Drive safe." I drove home with the windows down. The night air smelled like cut grass and distant rain. When I pulled into my own yard, I sat in the truck for a minute with the engine off, looking across the dark field toward the faint glow still coming from May's kitchen window. I told myself again that it was nothing. Just two neighbors who helped each other out. Just a habit that had gotten a little stronger than it should have. But when I finally went inside, I left the porch light on. And for the first time, I didn't bother turning on the radio to fill the house with noise. The community hall was already loud when I got there. Tom had shown up at my place right after supper, leaned against the truck door, and told me in that flat way of his that if I spent another Saturday night alone fixing the barn, I was going to turn into an old man before I hit 40. I tried to say no. He kept standing there until I gave up and changed my shirt. I arrived late on purpose. The place was packed. Folding chairs along the walls, a small stage with a country band that was already halfway through their second set, long tables covered with pies and casseroles and those big galvanized tubs of lemonade. Kids ran between people's legs. The air smelled like cinnamon and wood smoke from the heater in the corner. I spotted May almost as soon as I walked in. She was standing near the lemonade table in a simple blue dress with small white flowers on it, the kind that didn't try too hard. Her hair was pulled back halfway, loose strands brushing her neck, and she still had the same brown boots on that she wore every day on the farm. She wasn't dressed up like some of the other women, but she didn't need to be. When she laughed at something Ruth said, I heard it across the room even over the music. That surprised me. I hadn't realized I'd gotten so used to the sound of her laugh that I could pick it out in a crowd. Tom elbowed me in the ribs. "Don't stare so obvious," he muttered. "I'm not staring." "Jack, you look like you're about to buy the whole damn building, just because she's standing in it." I ignored him and headed for the lemonade. May saw me before I reached the table. She lifted her cup slightly in greeting, the way she always did when we passed on the road. "You actually came," she said when I got close. "I figured you'd tell me one of your cows needed emotional support or something." I asked them. They said I should get out and socialize. She smiled into her cup. "First time I've ever agreed with your cows." We stood there talking like we always did, easy, a little teasing, nothing that required thinking too hard. But something felt different tonight. Maybe it was the lights in the hall, softer than the harsh work lights we usually stood under. Maybe it was the fact that there was no fence between us. Or maybe it was just that I was finally letting myself notice how much I liked being near her. Then Carter walked over. He'd moved to town a few months earlier to manage the big horse operation south of the highway. Tall, clean-shaven, the kind of guy who looked comfortable in a room full of people. He smiled at May and held out a hand. "May, would you like to dance?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes flicked to me, just for a second, but long enough that I felt it in my chest. I didn't know what she was waiting for. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, so I did the stupidest thing a man can do when he doesn't understand his own feelings. I smiled like it was nothing and said the first thing that came out of my mouth. "Go on, May. At this rate, you'll never get married. You've got to take a chance when it shows up." I thought she'd roll her eyes. I thought she'd come back with something sharp that would put me in my place the way she always did. I thought we'd laugh about it later, like we laughed about everything else. But May didn't laugh. She looked at me for a long moment. Something changed in her face. Not anger, not hurt exactly. Just a quiet kind of seriousness that made the noise around us fade out. She stepped closer, close enough that only I could hear her, and said it low. "Only if you ask me." Then she turned to Carter, polite as anything. "Thank you, but I think I'm going to sit this one out." She walked away toward the dessert table without looking back. I stood there like someone had hit me in the ribs. Carter glanced between me and May's retreating back, confused. "What was that about?" he asked. I kept watching her. "Go ask someone else to dance." I left not long after that. Didn't say goodbye to Tom. Just walked out into the cold October night and started down the dirt road toward home instead of getting in the truck. The air was sharp enough to sting my lungs. The sky was clear and full of stars. On either side of the road, the pastures were dark, and every now and then I could see the faint yellow glow of a farmhouse window in the distance. I kept hearing her voice. "Only if you ask me." I thought about every stupid excuse I'd made over the last few months. The chicken, the fence, the squash, the water trough, the way I'd started timing my chores so I might run into her, the way I looked across the field every evening just to see if her kitchen light was still on. All of it had been leading to this one moment, and I'd been too slow and too scared to see it. She'd been telling me for a long time, not with big declarations, just by being there, by letting me into her days one small thing at a time, by trusting me enough to argue with me, to laugh with me, to wait while I figured out what was already obvious to everyone else in town. I stopped in the middle of the road and looked back toward the faint light still shining from May's kitchen window, far across the fields. For the first time, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. I was in love with her, and I'd spent months using my own slowness as an excuse to stay safe on my side of the fence. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard May's voice from the night before, low and steady, right next to my ear. "Only if you ask me?" By the time the sky started to turn gray, I gave up on the bed. I made coffee, drank half a cup, then left the rest sitting on the counter. I went out to the barn, fed the cows, checked the water, but my head wasn't on any of it. Around 9, I loaded the truck with a new fence post, the post hole digger, a roll of wire, and the toolbox. The southeast corner of May's fence had been soft for months. I'd noticed it every time I drove past. I'd even thought about fixing it a couple of times, and then talked myself out of it. Today, it felt like the only decent excuse I had. When I pulled up, May was in the garden behind the house, bent over checking the kale. She straightened when she heard the truck and wiped her hands on her jeans. Her eyes went straight to the post and tools in the back of the truck. "You here to make the chicken sign a contract never to cross again?" she asked. I lifted the post out. "Southeast corner's soft. I'm fixing it." She brushed dirt off her palms. "I know, I was going to get to it. I can do it." May looked at me for a second. The corner of her mouth moved like she was holding back a smile. "You don't have to." "I know." She didn't push. She just went back to the garden while I started digging the new hole. The ground was still cold from the night before. It took longer than it should have because my hands weren't steady. I kept thinking about what I was actually doing here. It wasn't about the fence, we both knew that. After almost an hour, she brought out 2 mugs of coffee. She handed me one and sat on the low wooden beam that ran along the inside of the fence line. I finished setting the post, tamped the dirt down around it, then joined her. We sat without talking for a while. The coffee was hot and bitter. The fields in front of us were quiet except for a few crows in the distance. The silence felt different than usual, not uncomfortable, just full, like something was sitting between us that neither of us had named yet. I set my mug down on the beam. I've been thinking about what you said last night. May kept looking out at the pasture. Have you? Her voice was calm. Too calm. She wasn't going to make this easy for me. That was fair. She'd already done the hard part by saying what she said. Now it was my turn. I'm slow, I told her. She turned her head. How slow? I let out a breath. Slow enough to be embarrassing. She smiled a little at that, but her eyes stayed serious. I looked down at my hands. They were covered in dirt and small cuts from the wire. Hands that were good at fixing broken things right in front of me. Saying what was broken inside me was a lot harder. I kept telling myself this was just neighbors helping neighbors, I said. The chicken, the fence, the squash, the water trough. I told myself if I didn't name it, it would stay safe. Easier. And now? She asked quietly. Now I know I was lying to myself. I wasn't coming over here because the fence needed work. I was coming over here because of you. I look across the field every night to see if your kitchen light is still on, because I want to know you're there. I argue with you because it's the best part of my day. And last night when Carter asked you to dance, I hated the idea of anyone else asking you something I should have asked a long time ago. May didn't say anything right away. I could feel her watching me. When I finally looked at her, her face had changed. The teasing was gone. There was something careful in her eyes. Hope, maybe? And a little bit of the hurt I'd probably put there by being so slow. I don't want to just be the guy who fixes your fence anymore. I said, I want to come over properly. I want to take you to dinner. I want to do this the way a man should when he's serious about a woman. May studied me for a long moment. Is that your way of telling me you like me, Jack? If you need it to sound better, I can try again. She shook her head and the smile came back, small and real. No, it's clumsy, straightforward. Sounds exactly like something you'd say after fixing a fence. I made a face. That bad? It's very you, she said, voice softer. So I like it. Something in my chest loosened for the first time since the fair. She picked up her coffee again, took a sip, then looked at me over the rim of the mug. I'm free Friday. For dinner? She nodded. For dinner, but Jack? Yeah? If you take another few months to decide whether this counts as a date, I'm letting the chicken move in with you permanently. I laughed. The sound felt strange after everything I'd just said, but good. Then I'll call it a date right now. May smiled at me. Not the smile she gave people in town. Not the one she used when she won an argument. This one was warmer, quieter, like she'd been waiting a long time to give it to me. And maybe she had. After that morning by the fence, things between us didn't turn into some perfect movie romance. We still argued. If anything, we argued more because now we weren't pretending the arguments were only about fences or chickens or whose squash tasted better. Our first real date was at the small diner in town. I wore the cleanest shirt I owned. May showed up in a simple dress and those same brown boots. We ordered steak and mashed potatoes and apple pie. For the first 20 minutes, we debated whether the gravy at this place was better than the one at the old diner on the highway. The waitress walked past our table 3 times, probably wondering if we were on a date or about to start a lawsuit. It was the best night I'd had in years. After that came Sunday afternoons walking the edges of the pastures together. Long evenings that stretched past midnight because neither of us wanted the conversation to end. I started going over to help her close up the horse stall at night, and she started coming over to fix my ledger books because, according to her, my handwriting looked like it had been done by a cow with artistic ambitions. We talked about the farms, about our parents, about the years she'd spent figuring things out alone after her father died, and about my quiet fear that if I let someone in and then lost them, the house would feel even emptier than before. May never tried to fix me with soft words. She just stayed. Straightforward, patient. Sometimes gentle. Sometimes she drove me crazy. The longer we went on, the more I understood that love doesn't always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it shows up the same way May had, standing on the other side of a fence smiling because her chicken had just claimed your land. By the time winter came, I knew I didn't want to end my days sitting alone on my own porch anymore. I wanted to look over and see May not across a field, but in the chair next to mine. I wanted to hear her tell me my coffee was too bitter. I wanted her to argue with me about how I stacked firewood and then lean against my shoulder when we both got quiet and watched the sun go down. I asked her to marry me on a cold afternoon in early December on the porch of her house. No music, no lights, no audience. Just 2 mugs of coffee, a chicken wandering across the yard like it had appointed itself witness, and May sitting beside me in a cream-colored sweater. I had rehearsed a longer speech in my head on the drive over, but when I turned to look at her, every polished sentence disappeared. May would see through anything that wasn't true. She always had. I set my coffee down. May. She didn't look at me right away. Yeah? I need to ask you something. She raised an eyebrow. You need to ask me things pretty often. Be specific. I took a slow breath. Will you marry me? May turned her head. For the first time since I'd known her, she went completely still from surprise. I pulled the small ring out of my jacket pocket. It wasn't expensive. It was the one I'd picked out weeks ago because I already knew she wouldn't want anything flashy. I'm not going to pretend I can write poetry, I said. You'd catch me in a second. What I do know is that I want to spend whatever years I have left with you. I want to argue with you about fences and hay and coffee and how many chickens actually belong on a farm. I want to fix broken things with you. I want to lose about 40% of our arguments. May looked at me, eyes shining, even though her mouth was already curving into a smile. 50%. 45, she laughed. The same clear, real laugh I'd first heard the morning her chicken crossed my fence. Jack Calloway, are you seriously trying to negotiate how many arguments you're allowed to lose while asking me to marry you? I'm just setting realistic expectations. May wiped at her eyes, still laughing, and held her hand out. Yes, of course it's yes. You took long enough. I slid the ring onto her finger. The chicken let out a single loud squawk right on cue, like it had an opinion. May laughed again. I pulled her against me. Later, after we got married, the 2 farms stayed where they were, but we took down part of the fence between them. Not all of it. May said some boundaries were still useful, especially with my cows. We left a wide opening and made a clear path between the houses. Her chicken coop ended up closer to the garden. My cows got more pasture. The old house stopped feeling too quiet because May brought her laugh into it. Her neat ledgers, the smell of things baking, and a steady stream of opinions she insisted I needed to hear if I wanted to live right. Sometimes we still argue by the old fence line, but now every argument ends with coffee, or with her hand finding mine, or with her looking at me like she's saying, "You're still slow, but at least you finally asked." I used to think fences were built to keep everything in its proper place. May taught me that sometimes the thing that crosses the line isn't trouble. Sometimes it's love.